This is Sunday Focus, a weekly public affairs program that looks at the topics affecting our society and the people who are making a change in the community each and every day. The people who have vision for the next generation. Sunday Focus presents new challenges for us, keeping you informed with topics of local and regional interest. Now the host of Sunday Focus, Christine Manica.
Hello and good morning. Welcome back to another edition of Sunday Focus. We have been doing many discussions with the organization called the Freedom. They are at the forefront of helping victims of sex and labor trafficking navigate a new path. It's not an easy journey, but the hope is through education, others can help those who are being trafficked in our area and state. We have been talking with the CEO and founder of Call to Freedom, Becky Rasmussen, about the amazing organization in a variety of segments. We have been talking to survivors and their experiences. But what happens once a survivor comes forward? How do trafficking and the law come together? We have special guests in the studio and over the phone to cover how the law intertwines with trafficking. Please welcome back Becky Rasmussen, and hello to South Dakota Attorney General Marty Jackley, and another hello to Assistant U.S. Attorney Jeff Clapper. Hello and good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning.
Good morning. Glad to be here.
Becky, we have been discussing Call to Freedom's work for a number of different segments now, sharing survivor stories, but we haven't covered the law up until this point. How important is the law regarding any trafficking situation?
Very important. Obviously, we want to stop the demand. We want to stop human trafficking from happening in any community, including South Dakota. Call to Freedom doesn't do that. Call to Freedom provides supportive services to those that have been victimized by human trafficking. And we have two great individuals here today that are going to share their perspective and their work in the field from a prosecution side and from an investigation side. So we just can't wait to see. We've seen how these partnerships have worked really well together, and just what the future holds, as well as holding people accountable for what they're doing when it comes to human trafficking.
Yes, and again, welcome to South Dakota Attorney General Marty Jackley and Assistant U.S. Attorney Jeff Clapper. We really appreciate your gentlemen's time for coming on with us. Before we get started, why don't you tell us more about your background and who you are? Mr. Jackley, why don't we start with you?
Sure. I grew up in Sturgis. We have a family farm over in Vail, South Dakota. I went to South Dakota School of Mines and have a BS in electrical engineering. Went off to law school. Enjoyed private practice, and then I had a wonderful opportunity to serve as South Dakota's United States Attorney, working hand in hand with Jeff Clapper while he was an assistant. And then I became South Dakota's Attorney General. This is now my fourth term, and one of the focuses that I've tried to put in, not just the investigations and the prosecutions, but in the forensic digital work, has been on human trafficking and doing a better job working with survivors and victims.
All righty, Mr. Clapper.
I grew up in South Dakota, went to law school down at USD in Vermilion, and was in private practice for a while before I got the wonderful opportunity to work as a federal prosecutor at the U.S. Attorney's Office. And I've been doing that for the past 22 years. And for about the last 15 years, I've been involved in prosecuting cases involving internet crimes against children, sex trafficking, and lots of abuse cases against children and adults, primarily involving the internet.
Awesome. Now, before we kind of get into some statistics about trafficking here in South Dakota, there are two different types of trafficking. We have sex and labor trafficking. Can either of you explain the difference between the two?
Sure. You look at, and I'll use an example. When I was United States Attorney, the Oklahoma case came up, and that was a true labor trafficking case where there wasn't sexual favors required or a sexual component or element. It was straight work. The majority of cases we see in South Dakota, and unfortunately we've seen a lot of them, we get about 1,000 cyber tips a year, are in relation to sex trafficking, and those would require a sexual component to that, whereas typically coercion or forced sexual activities.
Anything else you'd like to add, Mr. Clapper?
Well, when we're talking about labor trafficking, we're talking about coercion and force to be involved in work. So a lot of times we see that happening where they're withholding paychecks there might be excessive hours and extremely low pay. And a lot of times it happens with foreign workers that are in our state, and they use that against them. They know that those people aren't familiar with our laws and the protections of our laws, and they make a lot of threats to expose them to their family or the law enforcement. And those people, get in these coercive situations where they're forced to work against their will.
Obviously, these cases are very difficult to process. So how do officials begin the process of investigating traffic reports? Let's start off with the labor trafficking side.
Well, you're usually going to have somebody come forward. These aren't things that you can identify by seeing them. You're going to have a person that's being forced into labor or somebody that knows them that comes forward to explain that. And then that's where the investigation process begins.
And he's exactly right. I couldn't agree more. Somebody has to come forward. And for that to happen, I think it's so important that there's that trust. As Attorney General, we've supported legislation that says, and we would never do this anyhow, but we would never prosecute a victim, and we're not able to by law. And we rely heavily upon organizations such as Call to Freedom in building that trust so that they see us, that when they come across a survivor or victim of whether it be labor trafficking or sex trafficking, that they know we have a specialized investigators. We have the ICAC, which is, you'll hear me reference that time and time again. It's under the Attorney General, but it is really a cooperative effort amongst federal, state, and local officials to handle these cases and have that expertise so that they're handled well. But it really starts with that survivor or victim feeling comfortable talking to us, and there's several steps of that. And it oftentimes involves faith-based groups or groups such as Call to Freedom that, they help build upon that trust so they're not just helping survivors. That's a very important component of that. But when they build that trust and they come to us, they're really part of helping prevent more victims so that we're able to step in and do it appropriately in protecting the victims and survivors, but stopping the bad guys from further labor or human trafficking or sex trafficking.
Let me just add, it's something we call the victim-centered approach. If we have someone come forward to tell us about this type of crime, whether it's labor trafficking or sex trafficking, we want to treat them with the dignity and respect that they deserve and not treat them as criminals. And probably one of the things I've learned over the time and the cases that I've worked on is you have to provide for the basic needs of the victims that come forward. Their health, their safety, food, a place to live. There's so many issues that come up, and that's why we need organizations like Call to Freedom, because law enforcement doesn't provide those services.
Yeah, absolutely. On average, it's hard to tell with these cases. How long can each case take? Just a rough estimate.
From the time, excuse me, Marty, but from the time someone reports it to the time maybe it goes to trial, we're talking over a year at least, and probably more like a year and a half is my estimation.
That's exactly right. I mean, the hope is always under the Speedy Trial Act, federal, you hope it would be 70 days. State, you'd hope it would be 180 days. But the reality is oftentimes these cases may have a digital evidence component. We're able to do some of that in the state, but there's some items we can't do. And so because there's a complexity to these, they may take a little longer than what I would call a general crimes type case, where there isn't perhaps a need for expert testimony. But again, that goes back to why organizations like Call to Freedom are so important, because we have built in the law enforcement side victim witness folks that help a victim in the court proceedings. But as Jeff kind of indicated, they're really focused on the court proceedings. They're not able to help with the getting on with life, the being able to feel comfortable going to work and doing the things that victims and survivors need to do, which is why there is such an important component when you start talking about the length of time for one of these cases. Yes, they take longer, perhaps longer than usual cases, but there's a reason for that, and there's a component built in the prosecution side to help with getting through that time frame and understanding the court proceedings. But then there's also components out there that are helping our victims and survivors getting back to a normalcy.
After that initial report is made, there is a lot of work that needs to be done to verify and corroborate some of the things that have been told to law enforcement, finding records, finding other witnesses. And typically what we find is even after the initial report, they're usually not telling everything because they're somewhat distrustful of everybody. They've lived a life of abuse and lies, and they've told some of their story to law enforcement, but not everything because they don't know what's going to happen. And that's on us to try to build that trust going forward. And that can take a period of time, and it's a process.
If you are just listening, we are continuing our coverage with Call to Freedom, being joined over the phone by South Dakota Attorney General Marty Jackley, and also joining us in the studio, Assistant U.S. Attorney Jeff Clapper, and Becky Rasmussen, CEO and founder of Call to Freedom, is with us. Jeff, I'll start with you for this question. What do you think, in your opinion, what's the most challenging case you have ever prosecuted?
Well, I can tell you they're all challenging. I've had plenty of them. A couple of that come to mind is just this sad case in Sioux Falls where a drug-addicted mom had her teenage daughter pimped out or prostituted to get money from adult men to give to the mom so she could buy drugs. That happened to a girl right here in Sioux Falls. Another case I had that just went to trial, this was a boyfriend-girlfriend relationship, as far as the woman knew. And we're talking about an adult woman. But as the relationship went on, it became physically abusive, more coercive, and that woman then escaped out of the state with her trafficker and had no place to go and was forced into prostitution until she finally broke free, and we were able to prosecute her trafficker here in South Dakota and bring him to justice.
Wow. Marty, any cases you would like to share?
Certainly, as you listen to Jeff, these are heart-wrenching. They tug at the heart. They're tough cases. And that's one of the reasons that oftentimes as Attorney General, we will rotate our lawyers and our investigators so that they're not spending too much time so that it affects them personally. I look back at probably one of the most challenging cases I prosecuted personally was the Boshi case. That was a North Dakota librarian. I think he was 38 or 39 years old. He started grooming at a very young age a young girl in Sioux Falls. Engaged in very inappropriate activities. It was challenging because of the content. It was challenging for me because it was the new federal law that came into place. And as a lawyer, you're balancing what happened to a victim, the traditional prosecution tools you have, and then the Congress had given us new tools. And it wasn't just challenging for me. I know it was challenging for Judge Pearsall as we went through the evidence and worked through the new law. I vividly remember those photographs. They stick with you. And so that's just one example. But I go back to a little bit about what Jeff said, too. All the victims are important to us. So when I look at, last year alone, we did 494 investigations. We issued 335 subpoenas. We executed 420 search warrants. Every one of those victims is important to us. They're important to our victim witness folks. It's important to us to have the reliance upon Call to Freedom and other similar organizations that help us with those survivors. And if anything, the message I want to send as Attorney General, all these cases are important to us, and we want to develop a trust where survivors and victims know they can come to us, they know that we will respect what has happened and do our best to make it right and to prevent it from happening to somebody else.
I just want to go back to that number really quick, what you just said, Marty. Over 900 investigations in South Dakota alone last year. When people say, oh, this isn't happening in South Dakota, there's no way that trafficking can happen in our state. Do you look back at those over 900 cases, and you probably do the same thing too, Jeff, and just think, yeah, it does happen, and you just think about cases like the ones that you just shared too?
Well, we know it happens because we prosecute the cases, and so I look back and of the 964 cyber tips, those would be considered cases, and the 494 investigations, they resulted in a lot of prosecutions. And if you look at what's happening, the cyber tips over the last 5 years are up 170%. And you look at the operations that the ICAC runs, whether it's during the Sturgis Motorcycle Rally or during a Sioux Falls event, they're presumed innocent, but we made 7 arrests, which means it's happening, and which cries out for the need for stronger legislation, cries out for the need for more resources for these investigations in the ICAC. Some of the federal funding has dried up, and that means it's my responsibility as Attorney General to go to the South Dakota legislature and state our case. And it's not just for the investigations or the prosecutions or the forensic lab. We have a component where now the Attorney General is involved in helping disperse funds, about $5 million to organizations that the legislature has entrusted us to do to help victims. That's one-time money, which obviously is important, but my desire is to make sure there's a continued funding source for those ICAC operations to protect kids and protect human trafficking, to make sure we've got enough prosecutors on the line that are knowledgeable and seasoned so that we can get the trust of those victims, and that we have, again, the best forensic lab out there in the nation so that we can make sure that evidence is preserved, protected, and ultimately provided to a jury to understand. So these are all important efforts, but again, it is real. When you look at the number of cyber tips, that number 964 is a concerning number.
Anything you'd like to add, Jeff?
Well, to give a historical perspective, we, prior to 2010, never prosecuted a sex trafficking case in South Dakota.
Oh, wow.
Since then, we've investigated and prosecuted cases every year since then. So it's happening in South Dakota. We've had a number of cases charged. We've had a number of cases go to trial. They're all tragic, and yet they're also shocking to most of the citizens in our community that kind of activity is going on around here.
Absolutely. I want to throw in the word, too. It's bittersweet to have these survivors, victims come forward, because it does show that trust and that they do want help. They're reaching out. Trust is one reason why it could be tough to identify a victim. What's another reason why identifying a victim, whether it's sex or labor trafficking, why else could it be tough to identify them?
Well, in my experience, they don't even realize they're being trafficked. Or even if they do, they're learning how to cope with their world, which is a horrible one, but they need to be survivors. And the person that's trafficking, or people that are trafficking them, are lying to them, abusing them, giving them drugs, giving them poor conditions, and yet they're completely reliant on them. And so given that world and an unknown world of what will happen if I report this to law enforcement, surprisingly, they stay in the world they know, because that's where they know how to survive and get by. And so when they do come forward, it's very difficult to make prosecutable cases, because a lot of times we're dealing with victims that are drug addicted, alcohol addicted, physically abused, They don't have great memories of the events that happened because, quite frankly, they don't want to remember them. And then when the police come and we're trying to find dates and times and places of where things happened, it's difficult sometimes to make that all come together in a prosecutable case.
Jeff's exactly right. I mean, oftentimes we find a very fragile survivor or victim. There have been levels of intimidation. They're oftentimes scared, and it goes back to why it is so important for us, through oftentimes beginning with Call to Freedom and those organizations, to have that trust. And I found with our investigators, oftentimes we help develop that trust by starting to listening, showing that we care by making sure that the victims and survivors, through our victim witness coordinators, know that we're issuing subpoenas, that we're not dismissing what the victim is indicating happened, that we're working towards developing a case the best we can, again, to hold those people accountable and to protect the victims from further intimidation or harm.
If you are just joining us right now, we are continuing our coverage with Call to Freedom, talking about how the law and trafficking intertwine with each other. We're being joined over the phone with South Dakota Attorney General Marty Jackley. Also with us in the studio, we have Assistant U.S. Attorney Jeff Clapper and the CEO and founder of Call to Freedom, Becky Rasmussen. Now, we have been kind of bringing down the mood here, I feel like, a little bit, but let's talk about those successful outcomes and how those cases come about when you do prosecute them. Jeff, I'll start off with you first.
You know, the most rewarding part of working on these types of cases is the hope that we're able to give victims. Because when they come to us, their world is completely chaotic, full of despair, and not having a hope. And so it takes a while also to build some trust, because so many times probably their trafficker has been turned into the police, maybe for domestic violence or some minor drug charge, and they beat the system. Witnesses don't show up, they get some deal, and now the thought process that goes into their head is, well, if I turn him in for trafficking, he's just going to get away with that too. And so those are the types of things that we have to overcome to gain their trust. In addition to providing for their basic needs, we have to show them we're serious about this case, the investigation, and the desire to prosecute it. Once we do that, that we're getting the information, we're following up with them, they start giving us more information. You can see the trust happen through the process. And once we charge the individual and that person's detained in jail in federal court, I can tell you it builds a lot of trust that goes a long way.
Jeff said it best, the hope for victims. And one thing that we do exceptionally well in South Dakota and this area are cooperative efforts. The ICAC is the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force, one of those prime examples where federal, state, and local authorities work so well together. And you don't just see that in the investigations, you see it with the prosecutions. The U.S. Attorney has the ability through mandatory minimums oftentimes to have that heavier hammer. But you'll see a little bit of rivalries between us once in a while, but we are one big happy family when it comes to the efforts we have in the investigations and prosecutions. And we work very well at making sure there are absolutely no turf battles and that these cases get prosecuted in the right place. And oftentimes that is in a federal courtroom because of those mandatory minimums. Certainly as Attorney General, I have made legislative efforts to continue to increase and strengthen our human trafficking laws, and I anticipate having that conversation again with the legislature, that as we look at these numbers, it's happening in South Dakota, and what opportunities do we have as a state to maybe even be a stronger partner as part of that ICAC and part of these efforts. And so you'll hear me talking as Attorney General about the need to re-examine some of the penalties and continue to strengthen them and provide additional protection for victims and survivors.
Wonderful. Becky, we're going to have you come back on with us here for a little bit. We've had a wonderful conversation this morning, I feel like. Is there anything else that you would like to share or add? Where do we go from here?
I'm just grateful, and that we have the opportunity for those that walk through the doors that are impacted by this, and we get to journey life with them on a daily basis. And it's hard to come forward to justice because a lot of them are told by their trafficker, and you heard that from both, that not to trust law enforcement. A lot of times they're told things and obviously deceived and been greatly deceived. Why would they trust Call to Freedom? Why would they trust law enforcement based on what they've experienced? And I think this just echoes the reason why survivors should come forward and feel comfortable with the process. You heard the heart of Mr. Clapper and the heart of Mr. Jackley, that they're for those that are being victimized, and the lies that are being told to individuals that are in human trafficking situations, that that's not the case, is simply not true. And so we have found, just as Mr. Clapper has said, that the safety and basic needs are two primary factors that need to be met, and also that they're believed. Their stories are so horrific. A lot of people don't want to believe that this is happening. And they don't think that people are going to believe them as well. And we're here today as a team to say that's not the case. We believe you, we see you, and if you are struggling with that situation, there are people that want to help you, and there's hope in this scenario.
Absolutely. And gentlemen, Becky, before we wrap up this conversation, from investigating and the prosecution sides, where do we see this work in the next 5 years? Marty, I'll start with you first.
I think what we see is a continued reliance and desire to strengthen groups like Call to Freedom and other faith-based organizations to help victims and survivors through the process. I think you see, at least while I'm Attorney General, speaking to the legislature about strengthening the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force, as well as our legislative laws, so that we are able to make sure we're doing everything we can as a state to be proactive in our investigations and be preventative. And I think that we will have good opportunities in South Dakota to continue to, frankly, lead the nation on these efforts. But it does exist here in South Dakota, and I think, number one, we got to recognize it, and number two, we need to do something about it.
I'd continue on with what Marty says. You know, it is a extremely collaborative effort. It takes everybody in law enforcement from a federal, state, and local aspect. It also takes outside organizations. It's a group effort that not any one entity can follow through on or keep up with, because there's just a lot to it. We are very fortunate in our state to have somebody like Marty that's been the head federal prosecutor and now is the head state prosecutor. So he's been in both systems. He sees how it works, and he's continued that as the Attorney General to make sure there is cooperation amongst state and federal prosecutors, as well as state and federal law enforcement officers. And that's really the key to future success, is continued collaboration and continued education. You know, this program is great for the citizens. Mm-hmm. It's also important for us in the law enforcement community to continue to educate new law enforcement officers on what to look for.
I would love to see the needle go from less than 1% of victims identified, and that keeps continuing going up. And as you've heard from everyone, that collaborative effort is definitely, and the education piece, I think one of the things at Call to Freedom we're very passionate about. We used to serve just adults, women that were walking through the doors, and we would listen to their journey and realize that they had been victimized as kids and had never got identified or identified themselves. And so we have just started a new program called Speak Up. We're actually collaborating with Sioux Falls After School program, and we are getting to kids kindergarten early. We're talking to them about internet safety, what is consent, what are healthy relationships, and that education piece. How can we get to kids and vulnerable populations before some of these perpetrators do? So we would love to see kids saying no as they become teenagers and adults, that we don't have to have a Call to Freedom or have to prosecute these cases. We know that's probably not realistic, but that would be our dream in 5 years.
Wonderful stuff. Again, we're in the studio with Becky Rasmussen, CEO and founder of Call to Freedom, Assistant U.S. Attorney Jeff Clapper, and with us over the phone, South Dakota Attorney General Marty Jackley. Gentlemen, Becky, we appreciate your time, and thank you so much for joining us this morning.